Part 1. The Cottage with Lace Curtains. There was something about lace curtains that invited trust. They softened the edges of the world, filtering harsh daylight into something gentler, kinder, like the sort of homes where nothing truly dreadful could ever happen. In the quiet village of Alderwick, such curtains were almost a symbol of respectability, and none were more admired than those hanging in the front window of Rosebank Cottage. Miss Eleanor Finch had kept them spotless for nearly 40 years. Such a particular woman, Mrs. Hargreaves remarked that morning, standing just outside the low stone wall that bordered the cottage garden. Never a speck of dust. I used to say you could eat your supper off those window sills. Miss Marple, who had arrived in Alderwick only 2 days before to visit an old acquaintance, nodded mildly. She had learned long ago that remarks about cleanliness often carried deeper implications. Yes, she said softly, people who care very much for small details sometimes notice rather more than they should. Mrs. Hargreaves blinked at her, slightly puzzled, but before she could reply a constable stepped out of the cottage, removing his hat with a solemn expression. Behind him, Dr. Linton followed, his face grave. The news had spread quickly, as it always did in small villages. Miss Finch was dead. It had been Mrs. Dalloway, the housemaid who came twice a week, who found her. She had arrived that morning at 9:30, expecting to be greeted by the familiar sound of Miss Finch's careful footsteps and the precise click of the kettle being set upon the stove. Instead, she found silence, and Miss Finch, seated upright in her armchair by the window, as though merely resting. She looked peaceful, Mrs. Dalloway had said tearfully to anyone who would listen, just as though she'd drifted off. The lace curtains were drawn halfway, just as she always liked them. Dr. Linton had initially agreed. A heart failure, most likely, he murmured now to the constable, though his tone lacked conviction. At her age, it would not be unexpected. Miss Marple watched him closely. There was hesitation there, small but unmistakable. "Something troubles you, doctor?" she asked gently. He hesitated, glancing at her with mild surprise. "Ah, Miss Marple? Miss Marple?" He gave a polite nod. "It is probably nothing. Only Miss Finch was not a woman who tolerated disorder. Yet there were, minor irregularities." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "Irregularities?" she repeated. "Yes. Her teacup, for instance. It had been placed on the table, but not quite in its usual position. And the sugar bowl, she always kept it to the right, precisely 2 inches from the tray's edge. Today it was misplaced." Mrs. Hargreaves gave a little sniff. "That hardly sounds suspicious, doctor. Perhaps her hand slipped." "Perhaps," he agreed. But again, that note of uncertainty lingered. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her gaze drifted toward the cottage window. The lace curtains stirred faintly in the breeze. Alderwick was not a village accustomed to scandal. Its people valued routine, familiarity, and above all the appearance of harmony. Disagreements, when they occurred, were handled quietly, behind closed doors, and with voices carefully lowered. It was the sort of place where everyone knew one another's business, yet pretended not to. Miss Finch had been, in many ways, its perfect resident. She had lived alone since the death of her brother some 20 years earlier. She attended church without fail, contributed generously to local charities, and maintained a polite but distant relationship with her neighbours. "No close friends," Mrs. Hargreaves confided later that afternoon, as she poured tea for Miss Marple in her sitting room. "But no enemies either, at least none that anyone would speak of." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "That is often the case," she said. "Enemies are seldom advertised." Mrs. Hargreaves gave a nervous laugh. Surely you don't think there's anything sinister?" "I think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that when something appears entirely ordinary, it is sometimes worth asking why." Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow walk past Rosebank Cottage. The constable had finished his initial inquiries, and the front gate stood slightly ajar. The garden, though modest, was meticulously kept. Each flower bed arranged with care, each path neatly swept, yet something felt wrong. Not visibly so, but subtly. Miss Marple paused by the window. The lace curtains were still there, delicate and white catching the late afternoon light. But as she leaned slightly closer, her sharp eyes noted something curious. One corner of the curtain hung unevenly. It was the smallest of details, so small that most would never notice it. But Miss Finch, by all accounts, would have noticed, and corrected it. Immediately. Miss Marple straightened, her expression thoughtful. A disturbance, she murmured to herself. A very slight one, but deliberate, I think. A voice behind her made her turn. You've a keen eye, Miss Marple. It was Mr. Calder, the village grocer, a tall, thin man with a habit of speaking as though he knew more than he said. Miss Finch was always particular about those curtains, he continued. Never saw them out of place before. Indeed, Miss Marple said mildly. He nodded. She'd stand right there every morning adjusting them. Said it helped her see without being seen. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. How very sensible, she said. Yes, Mr. Calder replied slowly, though I always thought it a bit secretive, if you ask me. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People who observe from behind lace curtains often see more than others realise, she said. And sometimes more than is safe. Mr. Calder shifted uncomfortably. You don't suppose she saw something, do you? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her gaze returned to the window, to the delicate fabric that both revealed and concealed. It is possible, she said at last. And if she did, then someone may have wished to ensure she never spoke of it. That evening the village settled into an uneasy quiet. Lights flickered on in cottages and houses alike, but conversations were subdued, glances more cautious than usual. News of Miss Finch's death had unsettled something beneath the surface, a faint ripple of unease, and in the small guest room where she was staying, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. Her mind moved steadily, piecing together fragments, a misplaced teacup, an uneven curtain. A woman known for precision, found in a scene that was almost, but not quite, perfect. She smiled faintly to herself. Yes, she murmured, almost perfect, which is, of course, the most suspicious thing of all. Outside, the night deepened, and behind the lace curtains of Rosebank Cottage, the first shadows of truth began quietly to stir. The habit of small observations. Miss Marple had often said that human nature was remarkably consistent, no matter where one went. Alderwick, with its clipped hedges and polite greetings, was no exception. Beneath its calm exterior, she sensed the familiar undercurrents. Envy tucked beneath admiration, resentment disguised as civility, and secrets carefully folded away like letters in a drawer. The following morning dawned pale and cool, the sort of English countryside morning that seemed too gentle to harbour anything unpleasant. Yet Miss Marple rose early, her mind already at work. She had learned long ago that truth rarely announced itself loudly. Instead, it revealed itself in small inconsistencies, habits disrupted, routines altered, expressions that flickered for a fraction too long. And Miss Eleanor Finch, by all accounts, had been a woman of habits. The village bakery proved to be an excellent place for quiet observation. Miss Marple entered just after 9, greeted by the warm scent of fresh bread and the low murmur of conversation. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Ellison, a cheerful woman whose round face and quick hands suggested both efficiency and curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, recognising her at once. "Such a dreadful business, isn't it?" Poor Miss Finch. "Very sad indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "I understand she was well known here." "Oh yes," Mrs. Ellison said, lowering her voice slightly as another customer passed. "Came in every Thursday without fail. Always the same order, brown loaf, 2 currant buns, and a small jar of honey." "Consistency is comforting," Miss Marple said. "That's just it," Mrs. Ellison continued. "Yesterday wasn't Thursday, but she came in anyway." Miss Marple looked up. "Did she?" she said quietly. "Yes, and that's what struck me as odd. She seemed distracted. Paid me twice, if you can believe it. I had to call her back to return the extra coins." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. "Did she say anything?" she asked. Mrs. Ellison hesitated. "Not much. Only that she'd forgotten something important. But when I asked what, she just shook her head and left." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A woman like Miss Finch did not forget things. From the bakery, Miss Marple made her way toward the churchyard. It was there that she encountered Reverend Pike, who was trimming a hedge with careful precision. He greeted her warmly, though his expression carried a trace of unease. "These are unsettling times," he said. "One does not expect such occurrences in a place like Alderwick." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "though one might argue that such places are precisely where they are least expected, and therefore most effective." The Reverend paused, considering this. "You think there was something deliberate?" he asked. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that Miss Finch's life was governed by routine. And when such a routine is disturbed, it is rarely without cause." Reverend Pike nodded slowly. "She did seem troubled at the last service. I remember now, she lingered afterward, as though she wished to speak, but then changed her mind." "Did she often confide in you?" Miss Marple asked. "Not particularly. She was private, but there was something in her manner that day. A hesitation." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Hesitation can be very telling," she said. "It often indicates a conflict between what one knows and what one dares to say." By midday, Miss Marple had gathered a collection of such small observations. Individually, they meant little, but together, they formed the faint outline of something far more troubling. Miss Finch had broken her routine. She had appeared distracted. She had nearly spoken, yet held back. And now, she was dead. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned once more to Rosebank Cottage. This time she was accompanied by Constable Briggs, who had taken a quiet interest in her observations. "I must admit, Miss Marple," he said as they approached the gate, "it all seems rather slight. A misplaced teacup, a crooked curtain, hardly evidence of foul play." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "My dear Constable, it is often the smallest details that betray the greatest truths. Large crimes are rarely committed without leaving small traces." He nodded, though he did not look entirely convinced. Inside the cottage the air felt still, unnaturally so. Miss Marple moved slowly through the sitting room, her eyes taking in every detail. The furniture was arranged with meticulous care, each object placed with deliberate intention, and yet, there it was again. That sense of something being not quite right. She approached the small table by the armchair. The teacup sat upon its saucer, exactly as described. But as she leaned closer, she noticed something curious. A faint stain along the rim. Not tea, something darker. "Constable," she said quietly, "has this cup been examined?" He shook his head. "Dr. Linton saw no reason. Said it was likely natural causes." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the cup. "Perhaps," she said softly. And yet, Miss Finch was not a careless woman. She straightened, her expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Constable, was anything missing from the house?" "Nothing that we could find," he replied. "Everything appears to be in order." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. "That is precisely what concerns me." Before leaving, she paused once more by the window. The lace curtains hung quietly, their delicate patterns casting faint shadows across the room. But now, in the clearer light of afternoon, she noticed something else. A slight tear near the edge, barely visible, but unmistakable. Miss Marple reached out, touching the fabric lightly. "A struggle?" Constable Briggs suggested. "Not necessarily," she replied, "but perhaps an interruption." She turned to him, her eyes sharp despite her gentle demeanour. "Someone came here," she said. "Someone who disturbed Miss Finch's carefully ordered world, and in doing so, they left behind just enough disorder to be noticed, if one knows where to look." The constable frowned. "But why would anyone wish to harm her? She had no enemies." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "My dear Constable," she said, "everyone has enemies. The difference lies only in whether they are visible." As they stepped bare into the fading light, Miss Marple felt the quiet certainty that had guided her so often before. This was no simple death. It was something far more deliberate. And somewhere in Alderwick, behind polite smiles and carefully drawn curtains, someone was waiting, hoping that their small mistake would go unnoticed. But Miss Marple had already seen it, and she had no intention of looking away. The quiet neighbours. If there was one thing Miss Marple trusted above all else, it was the simple truth that people were creatures of habit, and that habits, when disturbed, revealed far more than words ever could. By the third day, Alderwick had settled into a peculiar rhythm. Outwardly, life continued as usual. Shop doors opened, teacups clinked, and polite greetings were exchanged along narrow lanes. Yet beneath that calm surface, something had shifted. Conversation stopped a fraction too quickly when others approached. Eyes lingered a little longer than necessary. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the sort of atmosphere in which truth began to loosen its grip on secrecy. She began her morning with a deliberate purpose. If Miss Finch had seen something worth killing for, then it must have involved someone nearby, someone within sight of those lace-curtained windows. And so Miss Marple turned her attention to the neighbours. The first was Mrs. Keating, who lived in the cottage directly opposite Rosebank. She was a sharp-featured woman with restless hands and a voice that carried easily across a room. When Miss Marple called, she was invited in with an eagerness that suggested both loneliness and curiosity. "Such a dreadful affair," Mrs. Keating said at once, ushering her into a tidy sitting room. "I still can't believe it. Miss Finch was the last person one would expect. Well, anything unpleasant to happen to?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And yet, unpleasant things do have a way of occurring where they are least expected." Mrs. Keating leaned forward. "You think it wasn't natural, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think it is always wise to consider all possibilities." There was a brief pause. Then Mrs. Keating spoke again, her tone lowering slightly. "She did watch people, you know." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Watch people?" "Yes, from that window of hers, always behind those lace curtains. You'd never know it unless you were looking for it. But she saw everything. Who came and went. Who spoke to whom." Mrs. Keating hesitated. "It made some people uncomfortable." "Did it make you uncomfortable?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Keating gave a quick laugh. "Oh no, I've nothing to hide." Miss Marple did not respond. She had found that such declarations were rarely as definitive as they sounded. The second neighbour, Mr. Leonard Graves, lived just beyond a narrow hedge to the east of Rosebank Cottage. He was a quieter man, reserved, with a habit of avoiding direct eye contact. When Miss Marple encountered him in his garden, he seemed almost startled by her presence. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." No, he replied quickly. "Not at all." Miss Marple glanced toward Rosebank Cottage. "You must have known Miss Finch well, living so close." He hesitated. "Well enough," he said. "We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more." "And on the evening before her death," Miss Marple asked, as though the question were of no particular importance, "did you happen to notice anything unusual?" Mr. Graves's hands tightened slightly around his gardening shears. "No," he said. "Nothing at all." Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "You see," she said, "I have always found that unusual things are often only unusual in retrospect. At the time, they seem quite ordinary." Mr. Graves said nothing, but Miss Marple noticed the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once again in the company of Mrs. Hargreaves. They sat together in the small sitting room, the familiar ritual of tea providing a comforting backdrop to conversation. "I do wish people wouldn't make such a fuss," Mrs. Hargreaves said, stirring her cup. "Dr. Linton has already said it was likely her heart." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and yet there are certain details that remain curious." Mrs. Hargreaves sighed. "You've been speaking to the neighbours, haven't you?" "A little," Miss Marple admitted. "Well, if you ask me," Mrs. Hargreaves said, lowering her voice, "Mrs. Keating is far too interested in other people's affairs. Always watching, always talking." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Indeed," she said, "and yet she's not the only one who watches." Mrs. Hargreaves looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple set down her teacup. "I mean," she said gently, that Miss Finch's habit of observation may not have been entirely one-sided. It is quite possible that someone knew they were being watched." A silence followed, and in that silence the idea took root. That evening Miss Marple returned to her room with a growing sense of clarity. The pieces were beginning to align, not neatly, not yet, but enough to suggest a pattern. Miss Finch had observed something involving one of her neighbours, and that neighbour, realising they had been seen, had acted. But the method, that still troubled her. There had been no sign of struggle, no obvious violence, only those small disturbances, the misplaced objects, the torn curtain, the faint stain on the teacup. "Not a crime of impulse," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "but of calculation." She rose and moved to the window. From where she stood, she could just make out the distant outline of Rosebank Cottage. Its lace curtains were still drawn, pale against the darkening sky. Such delicate things, so easily disturbed, and yet so revealing. As night fell over Alderwick, a quiet unease settled in. Behind closed doors, thoughts lingered longer than usual. Words were chosen more carefully. And somewhere, Miss Marple was certain of it, someone was beginning to realise that their carefully constructed illusion was starting to unravel. Because in a village like Alderwick, nothing remained hidden forever. Not behind walls, not behind smiles, and certainly not behind lace curtains. A matter of timing. Miss Marple liked to think of time as one of the most honest witnesses in any mystery. People might lie, omit, or misremember, but time, when properly observed, rarely contradicted itself. It was simply a matter of asking the right questions. The following morning Alderwick appeared brighter, as though the village itself had decided to shake off the unease that had settled over it. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps with renewed vigour, and neighbours greeted one another with an almost exaggerated cheerfulness. But Miss Marple noticed the effort behind it. People were trying too hard, and that, in her experience, was always significant. She began her day with a visit to Dr. Linton. His surgery stood at the far end of the village, a modest building with ivy creeping along its walls. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic and polished wood. "Miss Marple," he said, clearly surprised but polite as ever, "what can I do for you?" "I hope you won't mind a few questions," she said gently. "About Miss Finch?" He hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, though I'm not certain how much help I can be." Miss Marple took a seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You examined her yesterday morning," she began. "What time, precisely?" "Shortly after 10, he replied. "Constable Briggs called for me as soon as the body was discovered." "And in your professional opinion, when did she die?" Dr. Linton frowned slightly. "It's difficult to be exact, but I would estimate sometime between 8 and 9 in the evening." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And the cause?" He paused. "At first glance I believed it to be heart failure. However," he trailed off. "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "There were certain irregularities," he admitted. "Nothing conclusive, but enough to make me uneasy." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Irregularities such as?" "A slight discoloration around the lips," he said slowly. "And the stain on the teacup you mentioned to the constable. It may indicate that something was ingested." "Poison?" Miss Marple suggested. Dr. Linton sighed. "It is a possibility, though I would prefer to wait for a proper analysis before drawing conclusions." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, one must never rush such matters." But inside, her thoughts were already moving ahead. Poison, quiet, controlled, easily mistaken for natural causes. Yes, that would fit. From the surgery, Miss Marple made her way toward the village post office. It was a small place, run by a thin, spectacled man named Mr. Hensley, whose knowledge of local affairs rivaled that of any newspaper. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Another dreadful day for Alderwick, I'm afraid." "Yes," she agreed, "though I find that such days often reveal more than they conceal." Mr. Hensley gave a small, knowing smile. "You've been asking questions." "A few," Miss Marple admitted. "I wondered if you might help me with something rather specific." "I shall try," he said. "Do you recall whether Miss Finch received any letters yesterday?" Mr. Hensley considered this. As a matter of fact, she did. One letter in the Morning Post. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Was there anything unusual about it?" "Well," he hesitated. "It had no return address, just her name and the cottage." Miss Marple's gaze grew thoughtful. "And did you happen to notice her reaction upon receiving it?" Mr. Hensley shook his head. "I delivered it myself, but she said very little. Only thanked me and closed the door rather quickly." Miss Marple sat back. "A letter without a return address, received on the very day her routine was disrupted." "Yes," she murmured, "that is most interesting." By midday, Miss Marple had begun to form a clearer picture. Miss Finch received a letter that unsettled her. She broke her routine, appearing distracted. She may have seen, or realised, something she had not known before. And that evening, she drank tea that may have been poisoned. But one question remained. Who had been with her? That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Constable Briggs once more. He was standing near the village green, speaking with a pair of elderly men. When he saw her, He excused himself and approached. "Miss Marple," he said, "have you discovered something?" "Perhaps," she replied, "though I find it is often more useful to ask the right questions than to provide answers too soon." He nodded, accustomed now to her manner. "What would you like to know?" "Have you established Miss Finch's movements on the evening before her death?" she asked. "More or less," he said. "She returned home shortly after 4. No visitors were reported." "No visitors?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes. No one saw anyone enter or leave the cottage." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet, we have reason to believe she did not die alone." The constable frowned. "But if no one visited—" "My dear constable," she said gently, "in villages such as this, people often see less than they believe, and believe less than they see." He looked puzzled. Miss Marple continued. "Tell me, was there any way someone might have approached the cottage without being observed?" He considered this. "Well, there is a narrow path behind the garden. It leads through the hedgerows, not commonly used, but accessible." Miss Marple nodded. "Then it is possible," she said, "that our visitor was not as visible as we might assume." As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple returned once more to the quiet road that led past Rosebank Cottage. The evening light cast long shadows across the garden, and the lace curtains glowed faintly in the golden dusk. She stood for a moment, her gaze fixed on the window. Time. Everything came back to time. The letter, the visit, the tea. Each element placed with care, like pieces on a chessboard. But even the most careful player could make a mistake. And Miss Marple was beginning to see where that mistake lay. "Too neat," she murmured softly. "A death that appeared natural, a house that appeared undisturbed, a routine that was almost, but not quite, intact. Yes, too neat by far." She turned away, her expression calm but resolute. Somewhere in Alderwick someone had planned this carefully. They had counted on silence, on appearances, on the assumption that no one would look closely enough. But they had not accounted for Miss Marple. And as she made her way back through the quiet village, she felt that familiar certainty settle over her. The truth was there, not hidden, not buried, simply waiting to be seen at the right moment. The letter, without a name. Miss Marple had often observed that letters, those seemingly harmless carriers of ink and paper, possessed an extraordinary ability to disturb the human mind. A letter could unsettle a routine, awaken an old fear, or reveal a truth long buried, and Miss Eleanor Finch, it seemed, had received such a letter. The morning air in Alderwick carried a restless quality, though nothing in the village's outward appearance suggested change. Children walked to school, shopkeepers arranged their displays, and polite greetings passed from one neighbour to another. Yet Miss Marple sensed it immediately. Something had shifted, not visibly, but inwardly, like a ripple beneath still water. She made her way once again to the post office. Mr. Hensley looked up as she entered, his expression already expectant. "I had a feeling you might return," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "One often does, when something remains unfinished." He adjusted his spectacles. "About the letter?" "Yes," she said gently. "I wondered if you might recall anything more about it." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It was rather plain," he said. "Ordinary envelope. But—" He paused. "But?" Miss Marple prompted. "The handwriting," he said. "It struck me as unusual. Not untidy, but careful, as though the writer were trying not to be recognised." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. "Deliberately disguised, then?" "Yes, I believe so." "And the postmark?" "Local," Mr. Hensley replied. "Posted here in Alderwick." Miss Marple nodded. "So the sender is not a stranger," she murmured, "but someone within the village." Mr. Hensley shifted uneasily. "You think someone here?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that when a person hides their identity, it is rarely without reason." From the post office, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the lane behind Rosebank Cottage. Constable Briggs had mentioned it, a narrow, seldom-used path winding through hedgerows and overgrown shrubs. It was precisely the sort of place one might choose if one wished to avoid being seen. She moved carefully, her sharp eyes noting every detail. The ground was uneven, softened by recent dampness. Footprints would not remain clearly, but disturbances might. And there, Near a bend in the path she saw it, a faint impression, not distinct enough to identify, but recent enough to suggest passage. Miss Marple crouched slightly, examining the earth. One person, she murmured. Not a frequent visitor, but not entirely unfamiliar with the route either. She straightened, her thoughts aligning once more. The letter, the path, the unseen visitor. It was all beginning to form a pattern. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Keating once more. This time the woman seemed less eager. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile. "Back again?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I do hope you won't mind a few more questions." Mrs. Keating hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course." They sat together, though the atmosphere had changed subtly. Where before there had been curiosity, now there was caution. "You mentioned that Miss Finch often watched from her window," Miss Marple began. "Yes," Mrs. Keating said, "I did." "Did she ever speak to you about what she observed?" "Mrs." Keating shook her head quickly. "No, she kept her thoughts to herself," Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, you said it made some people uncomfortable." "Well," Mrs. Keating hesitated, "it's only natural, isn't it? No one likes to feel watched." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "especially if they have something to hide." Mrs. Keating's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I wouldn't know about that," she said. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "No," she said gently. "Perhaps not." The conversation drifted to safer topics, but Miss Marple had already noticed what she needed. Not what was said, but what was not. As she left, Miss Marple paused once more by the road facing Rosebank Cottage. The lace curtains stirred faintly in the breeze, as though whispering secrets to those who knew how to listen. "A letter," she said softly to herself. Written carefully, delivered deliberately, and received with unease. She clasped her hands together. "What did you learn, Miss Finch?" she murmured, "and why was it enough to seal your fate?" That evening Miss Marple sat quietly in her room, her knitting once again forgotten. Her mind moved steadily through the facts. The letter had been sent from within the village. Its handwriting was disguised. Miss Finch had been unsettled by it, enough to disrupt her routine, and sometime after reading it, she had been visited. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "There are two possibilities," she said softly. "Either the letter revealed something she did not know, or it confirmed something she already suspected." She paused. "And in either case, someone feared what she might do with that knowledge." A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Constable Briggs. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "I thought you should know. We've sent the teacup for analysis," Dr. Linton insisted. Miss Marple inclined her head. "That is most sensible." He hesitated. "There's something else," he added. "We've spoken to most of the villagers. No one admits to visiting Miss Finch that evening." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I would not expect them to," she said. He frowned. "Then how are we to find the truth?" Miss Marple rose slowly, moving toward the window. Outside, the village lay quiet under the soft glow of lamplight. "The truth," she said gently, "is rarely given. It must be observed." She turned back to him, her eyes clear and steady. Unfortunately," she added, "people reveal far more than they intend, if one only knows where to look." As Constable Briggs departed, Miss Marple remained by the window. Her gaze drifted once more toward the distant outline of Rosebank Cottage. The lace curtains were still, silent, but no longer innocent, because now Miss Marple understood something crucial. Miss Finch had not been chosen at random. She had been silenced, and somewhere in Alderwick, the writer of that letter, the careful hand behind the hidden message, was waiting, watching, perhaps even wondering how much had been discovered. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Oh, yes," she murmured softly. "We are getting closer now." And with that quiet certainty, the darkness surrounding the lace curtains began, ever so slightly, to thin. Beneath polite smiles, Miss Marple had always maintained that the most dangerous emotions were rarely displayed openly. Anger, when expressed, often burned itself out quickly. But resentment, quiet, patient, and carefully concealed, could linger for years, waiting for the smallest opportunity to surface. Alderwick, with its courteous greetings and well-kept gardens, was precisely the sort of place where such emotions thrived unnoticed. The next morning brought with it a subtle tension that even the most casual observer might have sensed. Conversations faltered more easily, laughter sounded slightly forced, and doors closed a fraction too quickly. Miss Marple, however, noticed something else. People were watching each other, carefully. She chose to begin her day with Mr. Leonard Graves. There had been something in his manner the previous day, a hesitation too deliberate to ignore. She found him once again in his garden, though his movements seemed less steady than before. When he saw her approaching, his expression tightened briefly before settling into polite neutrality. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning," she replied. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." There was a pause. Miss Marple allowed it to linger. "I have been thinking about Miss Finch," she said at last. "About her habits." Mr. Graves nodded stiffly. "She was a creature of routine." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and such routines are not easily broken, unless something compels them to be." He said nothing. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You mentioned that you noticed nothing unusual on the evening before her death," she continued. "Are you quite certain?" Mr. Graves's grip tightened around the small trowel in his hand. "I've already told the constable," he said. "I saw nothing." Miss Marple's gaze remained gentle but unwavering. "Of course," she said, "though I have often found that what we do not notice at the time can become clearer upon reflection." A flicker of unease crossed his face. "Well," he said slowly, "there was a light." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "A light?" "Yes, in her sitting room, later than usual. She was not one to stay up late." "And did you see anyone with her?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "No," he said. "No one." Miss Marple nodded. "But the light remained on?" "Yes." "For how long?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I went inside shortly after." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Graves. That is most helpful." As she turned to leave, she added gently, "It is always better to remember small things. They are often the most important." He did not reply, but Miss Marple could feel his gaze lingering on her long after she had walked away. By midday, Miss Marple had pieced together another small but significant detail. Miss Finch had been awake later than usual, waiting perhaps, or expecting someone. Her next visit was to Mrs. Dalloway, the housemaid who had discovered the body. She lived in a modest cottage at the edge of the village, her manner still shaken by the events of 2 days prior. "It was a terrible sight," she said, wringing her hands. "Though she looked peaceful, as I told you." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly. "You did." "I can't imagine why anyone would harm her," Mrs. Dalloway continued. "She was always so proper." Miss Marple nodded. "Tell me," she said gently, "did you notice anything unusual in the house when you arrived that morning?" Mrs. Dalloway frowned slightly, thinking. "Well, the kitchen was as it should be, everything clean, but the sitting room—" She hesitated. "Yes," Miss Marple prompted. "The fire had gone out," she said, "and that's not like her. She always banked it carefully before bed." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Always?" "Yes, without fail." Miss Marple leaned back slightly. "So the fire was left unattended," she murmured. "It would seem so." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Another small disturbance, another break in routine. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned once more to the lane behind Rosebank Cottage. This time, she walked its full length, observing not only the ground but the hedgerows, the narrow turns, the places where one might pause unseen. Halfway along the path she stopped. There, caught on a low branch, was a small fragment of fabric. Dark, unremarkable, but not belonging to the natural surroundings. Miss Marple reached out carefully, retrieving it. "A visitor," she said softly, "and not an entirely careful one." She slipped the fragment into her glove. Even the most cautious individuals made mistakes. It was simply a matter of finding them. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself once again in quiet reflection. The pieces were aligning more clearly now. Miss Finch received a letter. She became unsettled. She remained awake later than usual. Someone visited her, unseen, but not untraceable. Tea was served. Poison administered. And afterward. The scene was arranged, not perfectly, but carefully enough to deceive at first glance. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured. "Very careful indeed." She rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the village appeared calm once more. Lights glowed warmly behind windows and shadows moved quietly within. Such ordinary scenes, such ordinary lives, and yet, within them, extraordinary secrets. A soft knock came at the door once more. Constable Briggs entered, his expression more serious than before. "Miss Marple," he said, "the preliminary results have come in." She turned to face him. "And?" He hesitated. "There was something in the tea," he said. "A mild toxin, not immediately lethal, but enough to weaken the heart." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Administered carefully," she said. "So that it might appear natural? Yes, and likely by someone she trusted enough to accept tea from." The constable's brow furrowed. "But that could be anyone," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not quite anyone," she replied. "Only someone she did not fear." After he left, Miss Marple remained standing, her thoughts now moving with greater certainty. The circle was narrowing, the letter, the visit, the poison, each step deliberate, each action measured, but beneath that careful control, there had been something else, emotion, hidden but present. Because even the most calculated crimes were rarely free of feeling, and it was that feeling, quiet, concealed, but persistent, that Miss Marple intended to uncover next. As night settled over Alderwick once more, the lace curtains of Rosebank Cottage hung still and silent. But the illusion they had once created of gentleness, of innocence, was beginning to fade. And behind them, at last, the truth was starting to take shape. Threads of the past. Miss Marple believed that no crime truly began at the moment it was committed. Like a piece of lace, intricate, delicate, and deceptive, it was woven over time, thread by thread, long before anyone noticed the pattern. And now, in Alderwick, she had begun to see those threads. The morning carried a strange stillness, as though the village itself had grown weary of its own unease. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs subdued. Miss Marple, however, felt no such fatigue. If anything, her mind was clearer than ever. Because at last she understood where to look next, not at what had happened, but at what had come before. She began with the simplest of questions. Who was Miss Eleanor Finch, truly? Not the polite, careful woman the village believed her to be, but the woman beneath that quiet exterior. The answer, as it often did, came not from a single source, but from many small recollections. Mrs. Hargreaves provided the first thread. "She wasn't always like that," she said, as she poured tea with slightly trembling hands. "So reserved, I mean. When she first came to Alderwick, she was different." "In what way?" Miss Marple asked. "Warmer," Mrs. Hargreaves said after a pause. "More open. She used to attend gatherings, speak freely, but that changed after her brother died." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes," she said. "Grief can alter a person profoundly." "It wasn't just grief," Mrs. Hargreaves added quietly. "There were rumours." Miss Marple's eyes lifted slightly. "Rumours? Oh, nothing anyone could prove," she said quickly. "Only that there had been some sort of disagreement. Something about money, or perhaps a will. People talked, of course, but it was never discussed openly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course," she said. The second thread came from Mr. Calder, the grocer. He was less hesitant, though no less careful. "Miss Finch kept records," he said. "Detailed ones. Not just her own affairs, others as well." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet interest. "Others' affairs," he shrugged slightly. "Not in any official sense, but she noticed things. Who owed money? Who quarrelled? Who visited whom, and when?" Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And did she ever share these observations?" "Not directly," he said, "but she had a way of implying things, suggesting." "Enough to make people uncomfortable," Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A dangerous habit," she said softly. "Yes," Mr. Calder agreed, "especially in a place like this." The third thread came, unexpectedly, from Reverend Pike. "She came to see me once," he said, his voice low. "About a year ago." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And what did she wish to discuss?" He hesitated. "She asked about forgiveness," he said at last. "Not in a general sense, but very specifically, as though she had wronged someone, or believed she had." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And did she say more? No, he admitted. Only that some things once done could not be undone. Miss Marple sat back, her thoughts aligning. Yes, she murmured. Quite so. By midday, the threads had begun to form a pattern. Miss Finch had not been merely an observer. Branda. She had been a collector of knowledge, a keeper of small private truths, and perhaps a holder of secrets that did not belong to her. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned once more to Rosebank Cottage. This time she came alone. The constable had granted her access, though he had done so with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. "I trust your judgment, Miss Marple," he had said, "though I cannot quite explain why." Miss Marple had smiled. "Nor can I," she replied, "but it has served us both well so far." Inside the cottage the stillness felt heavier than before, not merely quiet, but watchful, as though the room itself held its breath. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes scanning every surface. She did not look for obvious clues. Those had already been found. Instead she looked for something subtler, something hidden in plain sight. It was in the writing desk that she found it, a small drawer, locked. Miss Marple examined it carefully, not forced, not damaged, which meant the key was somewhere nearby. She searched methodically, and after several minutes she found it, tucked inside a porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece. "Careful," she murmured softly. "Very careful." She unlocked the drawer. Inside were papers, neatly arranged, too neatly. Miss Marple lifted them one by one, receipts, notes, fragments of correspondence, and beneath them a bundle of letters, tied with a narrow ribbon. Her fingers paused, then she untied it. The letters were old, some faded with time, others more recent, but all shared one thing in common. They spoke of things not meant to be spoken of, arguments, debts, quiet betrayals, and in several cases, fear. Miss Marple read carefully, her expression growing more thoughtful with each page. "These are not merely observations," she murmured. "They are records. Records of weakness, of guilt, of vulnerability." And then she found it. A letter unlike the others, recent, written in the same careful, disguised hand described by Mr. Hensley. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. The words were brief, direct, and unmistakable. "You have seen too much. It is time to remain silent." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the page. Then she folded it neatly and returned it to its place. "Yes," she said softly. "That explains a great deal." She closed the drawer and locked it once more, replacing the key exactly where she'd found it. The room seemed unchanged, orderly, respectable, innocent, and yet everything had shifted. As she stepped outside into the fading light, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Miss Finch had not merely observed the village, she had documented it, collected its secrets, held them, perhaps even used them, and in doing so, she had made herself dangerous. "A dangerous woman," Miss Marple murmured softly, though she may not have realised it herself. Because knowledge, once gathered, carried a cost, and in Alderwick, someone had decided that cost was too high. As the evening deepened, the lace curtains of Rosebank Cottage stirred gently in the breeze. They still appeared delicate, still suggested innocence, but Miss Marple knew better now. Behind them had lived a woman who saw too much, and someone who had decided she must never speak again. The threads were no longer scattered, they were beginning to weave together. And soon, Miss Marple knew, the full pattern would be revealed. A pattern emerges. Miss Marple had always found that once a pattern began to reveal itself, it did so with quiet insistence, like a thread pulled gently from fabric, unravelling more than one had expected. By now, Alderwick no longer felt merely uneasy. It felt watchful. The knowledge Miss Marple had uncovered in Miss Finch's desk changed everything. This was no longer simply a matter of a quiet woman observing her neighbours. Miss Finch had been preserving their secrets, recording them with a precision that bordered on obsession. And someone had known. That morning, Miss Marple sent a polite message to Constable Briggs, requesting that he call upon her. When he arrived, slightly breathless and clearly curious, she greeted him with her usual calm. You have found something," he said at once. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. though I think it would be more accurate to say that something has found us." He blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. "In Miss Finch's desk," she began, "there are records, letters, notes, observations, not merely idle curiosities, but carefully preserved details of village life, matters of money, disagreements, relationships." The constable frowned. "You mean she was spying?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I prefer to think of it as observation taken to an unfortunate extreme. And these records, do they point to a suspect?" "Not directly," she said, "but they establish motive. Miss Finch possessed knowledge that could harm others." Constable Briggs shifted uneasily. "Right, then anyone could have wanted her silenced." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not everyone would act upon that desire. We must consider not only motive, but temperament." She rose and moved toward the window. "Tell me," she said, "have you noticed how people behave since her death?" He hesitated. "They're nervous." "Precisely, but nervousness is not uniform. Some are merely unsettled. Others are afraid." The constable leaned forward. "You have someone in mind?" Miss Marple turned back, her expression thoughtful. "I have several possibilities," she said, "but one, I think, stands apart." That afternoon, Miss Marple took another walk through the village. This time her steps were slower, more deliberate, not because she lacked direction, but because she wished to be seen. Observation, she knew, worked both ways. And if someone believed they were being watched, they might reveal more than they intended. She paused outside the grocer's shop. Mr. Calder greeted her with his usual reserved manner, though there was a tension about him that had not been there before. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "Good afternoon," she replied. "I've been thinking about what you told me, that Miss Finch kept records." He nodded cautiously. "Yes." "Did she ever confront anyone with what she knew?" Mr. Calder hesitated. "Not directly," he said, "but there were times when she would make remarks, subtle ones, enough to suggest she knew something." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "And how did people respond?" He gave a small, uneasy laugh. "Not well." From there, Miss Marple made her way toward Mrs. Keating's cottage. This time, she was not invited in immediately. Mrs. Keating opened the door only part way, her expression guarded. "Yes?" "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said gently. "I wish to ask you something rather specific." Mrs. Keating hesitated, then sighed. "Very well, come in." The sitting room felt less welcoming than before. The air itself seemed strained. "Miss Finch," Miss Marple began, "was known to observe her neighbours. Did she ever make any remarks to you personally?" Mrs. Keating's lips tightened. "No." Miss Marple waited. Silence stretched. Then, reluctantly, "She once mentioned my nephew," Mrs. Keating said. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "In what way?" "She implied that he had been seen in the village at a time he claimed to be elsewhere," Mrs. Keating said. "It was nothing, just gossip." "Really? Was it accurate?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Keating looked away. "I wouldn't know." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." As she left, Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. Small inconsistencies, hidden truths, and now a growing sense of fear among those who might have been exposed. But it was not until she encountered Mr. Leonard Graves once more that something shifted decisively. He was standing near the lane behind the cottages, the very path Miss Marple had examined before, and when he saw her, he startled, only slightly, but enough. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice controlled, "you seem to favour this part of the village." "It is very peaceful," she replied. "Yes," he said quickly, "very quiet." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the hedgerow. "It is also rather secluded," she added. He said nothing. A pause followed. Then Miss Marple spoke again. "Mr. Graves," she said gently, "have you ever received a letter that made you uneasy?" His reaction was immediate. Too immediate. "I don't see what that has to do with anything," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps nothing," she said. "And yet, I have found that letters can be most revealing." He shifted his weight. "I have work to attend to," he said abruptly. "Of course," Miss Marple replied. But as he turned away, she noticed something. His hand. It trembled. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly, her thoughts now moving with greater certainty. The pattern was no longer vague. It was distinct. Miss Finch had collected secrets. Some of those secrets had been known or suspected by their owners. A letter had been sent, a warning, perhaps even a threat. And one person. One person had reacted not with caution but with fear. Fear, Miss Marple murmured softly, is a powerful motivator. She leaned back, her expression calm. And when combined with resentment, she did not finish the thought. She did not need to. There was, however, one final detail that troubled her. The poison, administered in tea. A quiet, intimate act. Not the method of a stranger, but of someone who could sit across from Miss Finch without arousing suspicion. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Yes, she said softly. That is the key, I think. Because whoever had done this had been invited in. Outside, the village lay silent once more. But beneath that silence, something had begun to shift. The pattern was complete, the threads aligned, and the truth was closer than ever. The weight of silence. Miss Marple had often remarked, though rarely aloud, that silence was one of the most revealing conditions in human behaviour. Not the comfortable silence of companionship, nor the peaceful quiet of routine, but the strained, watchful silence that followed the disturbance of something carefully hidden. Alderwick now was steeped in that kind of silence. The morning began with a pale mist that lingered over the hedgerows and curled softly around the cottages. It lent the village an almost unreal quality, as though everything existed slightly apart from itself. Miss Marple observed it from her window, her hands resting lightly on her knitting, though she had not yet made a single stitch. An atmosphere of concealment, she murmured, most appropriate. For concealment, she knew, could only last so long. By now, the shape of the truth had begun to form in her mind, not as a single revelation, but as a convergence of small certainties. The letter, the records, the disturbed routine, the unseen visitor, and above all, the fear. Not general unease, but a specific, inward fear. The kind that belonged to someone who knew exactly what they had done. That morning, Miss Marple made a deliberate decision. She would speak once more with Mr. Leonard Graves. She found him not in his garden this time, but walking along the narrow lane that led toward the outskirts of the village. His pace was brisk, almost hurried, and when he saw her, he stopped abruptly. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Graves," she replied gently. There was a pause. Then, without invitation, she fell into step beside him. "It is a fine morning," she said. "Yes," he agreed quickly. "Very fine." Another silence. Miss Marple allowed it to stretch, her presence calm, unhurried. "I've been thinking," she said at last, "about Miss Finch." Mr. Graves's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone has," he said. "Indeed. But not everyone thinks in the same way." He did not respond. Miss Marple continued. "She was a woman of habits," she said. "Careful, observant, not easily startled." "No," he said quietly. "And yet," Miss Marple added, "something startled her." He glanced at her sharply. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple stopped walking. He took another step before realizing she was no longer beside him. Reluctantly he turned. "What is it?" he asked. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "The letter," she said. For a moment there was no reaction. Then, a flicker, brief, but unmistakable. "I don't know anything about a letter," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said, "but you know about fear." His expression hardened. "I think you should leave this to the authorities," he said. "My dear Mr. Graves," Miss Marple replied gently, "I have every intention of doing so. But before I do, I should like to understand one thing." "And what is that?" She tilted her head slightly. "Why you were afraid of her." The words hung in the air between them. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Afraid? Of Miss Finch?" he said. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked softly. The silence that followed was heavier than any before it. Mr. Graves looked away, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the hedgerows. "You don't understand," he said at last. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Then help me to understand," she said. He shook his head. "It doesn't matter now." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "it matters very much." For a moment it seemed as though he might speak. His hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders tightened, but then he exhaled sharply. "No," he said. "There's nothing to tell." Miss Marple studied him quietly. "Yes," she said. "There is." But she didn't press further. Not yet. Because she knew that forcing the truth too soon often drove it deeper into hiding, and Mr. Graves was not yet ready to reveal it. As she walked away, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle over her. He knew, not everything perhaps, but enough to fear Miss Finch, enough to react. That afternoon, Miss Marple met once more with Constable Briggs. They sat together in the small parlour where she was staying, the air thick with unspoken conclusions. "I believe," she said calmly, "that we are very close to the truth." The constable leaned forward. "You've identified the culprit?" "I've identified the pattern," Miss Marple replied, "and within that pattern there is one figure who does not fit." "Mr. Graves," he said at once. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You are learning, Constable." He flushed slightly. "But we have no proof," he said. "Nothing concrete." Miss Marple nodded. "Not yet," she said. "But we have something just as valuable." "And what is that?" She folded her hands. "Pressure." That evening Miss Marple took a final walk past Rosebank Cottage. The lace curtains hung as they always had, soft, delicate, deceptively innocent. But now she saw them differently, and not as a symbol of gentleness, but as a veil, a thin barrier between what was seen and what was hidden. She saw something, Miss Marple murmured, something she should not have seen, and Mr. Graves, whether through guilt, fear, or both, had realised it. The letter had been a warning, the visit had been a confrontation, and the tea had been the final act. Miss Marple paused, her gaze steady. "There is only one thing left," she said softly. The truth had been assembled, the pattern complete. Now, it needed only to be spoken, and when it was, the silence that had settled over Alderwick would finally be broken, not gently, but completely. The truth behind the curtain. Miss Marple had always believed that truth, when finally revealed, rarely came as a shock. Instead, it settled quietly into place. Like the final piece of a puzzle, inevitable, almost expected, yet no less unsettling for its clarity. In Alderwick, that moment had come. The gathering took place in Mrs. Hargreaves's sitting room. It was, Miss Marple thought, the most suitable setting. Familiar, orderly, and comfortably respectable. The sort of place where unpleasant truths could be spoken without quite disturbing the furniture. Constable Briggs stood near the fireplace, his expression serious. Mrs. Hargreaves sat stiffly in her chair, her teacup untouched. Mr. Calder lingered near the window, his usual composure replaced by a quiet tension. Mrs. Keating sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze flickering nervously from one face to another, and Mr. Leonard Graves. He stood apart, still, watchful. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, allowing the silence to settle. Then she spoke. "Thank you all for coming," she said gently. "I believe it is time we addressed what has occurred." No one replied, but their attention was unmistakable. Miss Eleanor Finch, Miss Marple continued, was a woman of habits. She lived quietly, observed carefully, and maintained a routine that rarely changed. She paused. And yet, on the day before her death, that routine was disturbed. Mrs. Hargreaves shifted slightly. "You mean the letter?" she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "A letter without a return address, written in a disguised hand, delivered locally." Her gaze moved slowly across the room. A letter intended not merely to communicate, but to unsettle. Mr. Calder cleared his throat. "You believe it was a threat?" he asked. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I believe it was a warning," she said, "one that Miss Finch understood all too well." She rose slowly, her movements unhurried. "You see," she continued, "Miss Finch was not merely an observer of village life. She was a collector of its secrets." A murmur passed through the room. "Secrets?" Mrs. Keating said sharply. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Matters of money, of relationships, of indiscretions." Her eyes rested briefly on each of them. She recorded these things carefully, methodically. Constable Briggs stepped forward slightly. "We found the letters," he said, "in her desk." The room grew quieter. "And so," Miss Marple continued, "we must ask ourselves, who would be most threatened by such knowledge?" She allowed the question to linger. "No one here has lived without fault," she added gently. "That is simply human nature. But there is a difference between fault and fear." Her gaze shifted and settled on Mr. Leonard Graves. He did not move, but something in his expression changed. "Mr. Graves," Miss Marple said softly, "you told me that you saw nothing unusual on the evening before Miss Finch's death." He said nothing. "You also said," she continued, "that you noticed a light in her sitting room, later than usual," a pause, "and yet you did not think it worth mentioning, until prompted." Mr. Graves's jaw tightened. "I didn't think it was important," he said. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "it was very important." She stepped closer, because Miss Finch was waiting. The words hung in the air. "Waiting," she repeated, "for someone who had written to her, someone who wished to speak, privately." Mrs. Hargreaves gasped softly. "You mean she let them in?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She would not have admitted a stranger, only someone she knew." Constable Briggs's voice was firm. "And you believe that person was Mr. Graves?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I do." Mr. Graves let out a short, humourless laugh. "This is absurd," he said. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "On the contrary," she said, "we have quite a great deal." She turned slightly, addressing the room once more. "Miss Finch had observed something," she said. "Something involving Mr. Graves. Something he believed, or knew, that she had recorded." Mr. Graves's expression darkened. "You're making assumptions," he said. "Am I?" Miss Marple asked gently. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small piece of fabric. "Dark, unremarkable, but not meaningless," she said. "This was found on the path behind Rosebank Cottage, a path Mr. Graves was seen near, more than once." Mr. Graves said nothing. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "there is the matter of the poison." She paused. "It was administered in tea, not forcibly, but quietly, calmly, in conversation." She looked at him steadily, which suggests trust. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as though the walls themselves were listening. "You were afraid," Miss Marple said softly. "Not merely of what Miss Finch knew, but of what she might do with that knowledge." Mr. Graves's hands trembled. "Stop," he said. But Miss Marple did not stop. "You wrote the letter," she said, "disguised your hand, delivered it yourself. You intended to warn her, to silence her." She took another step forward. "But when you met her, something changed." A long silence followed. "She did not yield," Miss Marple said quietly. "Did she?" Mr. Graves's head lowered slightly. "She had records, proof. Perhaps she even suggested she might use them." His breathing grew uneven. "And so," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but unwavering, "you chose a quieter solution." The words fell like stones. "You accepted her tea, or perhaps you offered to prepare it, and in that moment, you added the poison." "No," he said suddenly. The word echoed sharply in the room. Everyone froze. Mr. Graves's shoulders rose and fell as though he were struggling for breath. "I didn't mean to," he began, then stopped. The silence that followed was complete. Miss Marple spoke softly. "But you did," she said. He closed his eyes. For a moment it seemed as though he might remain silent, but then the weight of it broke. "She was going to ruin me," he said hoarsely. "You don't understand. She had everything written down, things that weren't even entirely true." Miss Marple said nothing. "She watched everyone," he continued, "judged them, collected their lives like trophies." His voice trembled. "I only wanted her to stop." Constable Briggs stepped forward. "And so you poisoned her." Mr. Graves shook his head weakly. "I didn't think it would." He stopped. But the truth had already been spoken. Miss Marple lowered her gaze slightly. "Crimes of calculation," she said gently, "are often born of very human fear." The room remained still. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside, the evening light faded softly over Alderwick, and for the first time since Miss Eleanor Finch had been found behind her lace curtains, the truth stood fully revealed, not hidden, not disguised, but unmistakably clear. The last light through lace curtains Conclusion. In the days that followed, Alderwick began, slowly, almost reluctantly, to return to its familiar rhythm. It was not an immediate change. Villages such as Alderwick did not forget quickly. They absorbed events, softened them with time, and folded them quietly into memory, where they became less sharp, less spoken of, but never entirely gone. Mr. Leonard Graves was taken away the morning after his confession. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, only the quiet arrival of authority, the closing of a door, and the absence that followed. By afternoon, his cottage stood still and silent, its windows dark, its garden untouched. People noticed, but they did not linger. Mrs. Hargreaves resumed her routines first. She polished her teacups with renewed determination, as though restoring order to her home might somehow restore order to the world beyond it. "Such a terrible business," she said one afternoon to Miss Marple, though her tone had softened now, not with fear but with a kind of weary acceptance. "And to think he seemed such a quiet man." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Quietness can be deceptive." Mrs. Hargreaves nodded. "I suppose one never truly knows people," she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "On the contrary," she said, "one often knows them very well if one pays attention." The village too began its subtle transformation. Conversations resumed, though with a new carefulness. Neighbours greeted one another as before, but their smiles carried a hint of something more reflective. Awareness, perhaps, or caution. Because Alderwick had learned something, that beneath its calm surface truths could exist, unspoken, unnoticed, and dangerous. Rosebank Cottage remained empty. For a time, no one wished to enter it. The lace curtains still hung at the window, pale and delicate, stirring gently in the breeze. They looked exactly as they always had, soft, harmless, inviting, and yet no one saw them in quite the same way. Miss Marple visited the cottage once more before her departure. She moved through its rooms quietly, her steps light, her gaze thoughtful. The sitting room was unchanged. The armchair still stood by the window. The small table remained in its place. Everything was as it had been, almost. She paused before the lace curtains. For a moment she simply looked at them. Then, reaching out, she adjusted the uneven corner. A small movement. A careful correction. "There," she murmured softly. "That is better." But even as she said it, she knew that nothing had truly been restored, because the illusion had been broken. Miss Eleanor Finch had lived behind those curtains, watching, observing, collecting the quiet truths of others. She had believed perhaps that knowledge gave her control, that by seeing everything she could remain untouched. But knowledge, Miss Marple knew, was not without consequence. It carried weight, responsibility, and sometimes danger. She saw too much, Miss Marple said quietly, and trusted too little. The letter, the records, the careful observations, they had all led to the same inevitable end. Not because Miss Finch had been cruel, but because she had misunderstood something fundamental about human nature. People, Miss Marple reflected, could tolerate many things, mistakes, flaws, even small betrayals. But they could not tolerate being exposed, not completely, not without mercy. Mr. Graves had not been a monster. That was perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. He had been an ordinary man, a quiet man, a man who had lived among them without drawing attention, and yet, when faced with the threat of exposure, he had acted carefully, deliberately, and fatally. Miss Marple turned away from the window. Her expression was calm but thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured, "it is always the ordinary ones." Outside, the village lay peaceful once more. The hedgerows rustled softly in the breeze. Distant voices carried faintly through the air. Life continued, as it always did. On her final evening in Alderwick, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. Her knitting lay neatly folded beside her, her hands still. She was not thinking of the crime itself, not any more. That had been solved, understood, placed neatly into its proper shape. Instead, she thought of something else. The lace curtains, their delicate patterns, their quiet deception. "They soften the view," she said softly, "make things appear gentler than they are." She paused. "But they do not change what lies beyond them. and that, she reflected, was the true lesson of Alderwick. Not that evil lurked in hidden corners, but that it existed quietly, often unnoticed, within the most ordinary of lives. Behind polite smiles, behind careful routines, and yes, behind lace curtains. The next morning Miss Marple departed. She left as she had arrived, quietly, without ceremony, but she carried with her the memory of Alderwick, its stillness, its secrets, its truths, and somewhere behind her, in a small cottage with carefully arranged furniture and delicately hanging curtains, the last traces of that truth lingered, not in the objects themselves, but in the understanding they had revealed, because in the end Miss Marple knew it was never the curtains that concealed the darkness, it was the people who stood behind them, and that was a truth far more enduring than any mystery,